A royal bride refusing a future king's proposal, twice. A sovereign forced to pop the question herself. And a royal engagement sealed without a ring at all. We picture royal proposals as flawless fairy tales, but the real history behind these jewels is far more complex. Today, we are tracing the evolution of royal love through the engagement rings of British queens. We are going to see how an exiled prince dismantled his mother's tiara to propose, look at a ring designed as a secret code, and uncover a forgotten betrothal jewel that historians have only just identified. What did it really take to accept these stones, and what do they reveal about the women behind the crown? Before we begin, please support my channel by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. Did you know that one of the most defining royal marriages of the 19th century began with a broken rule? Usually, it is the man who gets down on one knee, but when you are the reigning monarch, the strict rules of the British court dictate that no one can ask for your hand. You have to do the asking. In 1839, Queen Victoria was a young woman thoroughly enjoying her newly acquired independence. After a highly restricted childhood at Kensington Palace, becoming queen gave her a great deal of freedom, and she was not exactly in a hurry to give it up. In fact, she wrote to her uncle Leopold that she had no desire to change her position and wanted to wait at least 2 or 3 years before marrying. But then, her cousin Albert arrived at Windsor Castle, and everything changed almost instantly. The young queen was so entirely captivated that all her previous reservations simply vanished. On the morning of October 15, 1839, she sent for Albert to meet her privately in her closet. It's actually quite amusing when you think about it. The most powerful woman in the empire had to blush and make the first move herself. She asked if he would consent to her wish that they should marry. Later that day, she confided in her journal, writing that feeling loved by such an angel was too great a happiness to describe, calling it the happiest and brightest moment of her life. She even noted how she wanted to make the sacrifice he was making as small as possible, showing just how deeply she revered him. Even though Victoria was the one who had to propose, Prince Albert was the one who presented her with an engagement ring. He took this task very seriously, actually designing the piece himself. It was a beautiful 18-karat gold ring, shaped like a coiled serpent. Today, a snake might seem like a rather unusual, perhaps even unsettling choice for an engagement ring. But in the Victorian era, the serpent was deeply steeped in history, serving as an ancient Roman symbol of wisdom and everlasting love. Albert's design was incredibly thoughtful. The head of the serpent was adorned with rubies for the eyes and diamonds for the mouth, while a large emerald was set squarely in the center of the design. The emerald was chosen quite specifically because it was Victoria's birthstone. It was actually quite common during this era for engagement rings to feature birthstones, rather than the classic diamonds we are so accustomed to today. I always find it rather touching when a piece of jewelry goes beyond simply being an expensive gem and instead carries such personal, intimate meaning. It was an expression of pure adoration, and she cherished it deeply. And the celebrations extended to her wider family as well. On the day Victoria formally announced her engagement to the Privy Council later that November, her mother, the Duchess of Kent, gifted her a special bracelet to mark the occasion. We know so much about the profound sentiment behind Victoria's engagement, yet we are left with a rather fascinating mystery regarding the ring itself. There are no clear surviving photographs of this actual piece, only later descriptions. So, what happened to it? It is widely believed that Victoria was buried wearing it. According to historical accounts, the Queen requested to be laid to rest wearing as much of her jewelry as could possibly fit on her body. She was reportedly buried with both her and her husband's wedding rings, a ring on every single finger, bracelets stacked along her wrists, and layers of necklaces. While I have little doubt that Albert's serpent ring remained on her hand until the very end, I always find myself wondering about the rest of that final collection. Detailed, itemized inventories of her burial jewels seem incredibly difficult to track down. Perhaps some of you, my deeply knowledgeable viewers, have come across specific historical records or precise lists detailing exactly which other pieces accompanied the Queen? I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts or any historical insights you might have found in the comments below. While Queen Victoria had been lucky enough to find a devoted partner in Albert, securing a suitable match for her eldest son Bertie proved to be quite a challenge. Bertie had already developed a reputation for frivolity, which culminated in a rather scandalous youthful affair at an army camp in Ireland. Tragically, his father, Prince Albert, traveled to see him to resolve the situation, but fell gravely ill and passed away shortly after. Queen Victoria was entirely devastated. In her profound grief, she heavily blamed Bertie for his father's death, writing that she shuddered whenever she looked at him. Desperate to instill a sense of duty in her son and keep him out of further trouble, the Queen decided that an immediate, stabilizing marriage was the only solution. The royal matchmakers eventually set their sights on Princess Alexandra of Denmark. While she was undeniably royal, Alexandra's family lived quite modestly in Copenhagen compared to the vast opulence of the British court. A meeting was carefully orchestrated in Germany by Bertie's older sister, and the two young royals were introduced. Alexandra was famously beautiful, possessing a warm, sincere charm that seemed to instantly put people at ease. We so often hear about Bertie's later infidelities, but it is incredibly important to remember that at the very beginning, they were genuinely captivated by each other. Following another meeting in Belgium, Bertie proposed in September 1862 at the Royal Palace of Laeken. He was completely enamored, writing to his mother to confess that he never thought it possible to love someone as much as he loved Alexandra. Her devotion was equally fierce. She once sweetly declared that if he were a cowboy, she would love him just the same and marry no one else. To seal this incredibly hopeful union, Bertie presented her with a ring designed by the London jewelers Gerard & Co. At first glance, it might have simply looked like a vibrant, colorful band of gems. But this was an acrostic ring, a highly sentimental Victorian style where the first letter of each gemstone spells out a secret message. Alexandra's ring featured a beryl, an emerald, a ruby, a topaz, a jacinth, and another emerald. If you put the first letters of those stones together, they spell out Bertie. Having your fiancé's name spelled out in gemstones adds a wonderfully personal, intimate touch to an engagement ring. But the reality of their marriage proved to be far more complicated. Despite those early, sincere declarations of love, Bertie's restless nature inevitably took over. He eventually returned to his playboy lifestyle, filling his days with endless social engagements, trips to Paris, and a long, very public string of mistresses. It makes you wonder what went through her mind when she looked down at her hand as the years went by. She wore his name sparkling in gems, knowing perfectly well that she had to share him with so many other women. Yet, Alexandra never let the public see her heartbreak. She handled a very difficult marriage with quiet dignity and went on to become one of Britain's most genuinely beloved queens. Her ring remains a beautiful piece of jewelry, but to me, it's also a gentle reminder that even the most thoughtful proposal doesn't always mean an easy road ahead. Sometimes an engagement ring doesn't make it down the aisle with the man who originally gave it. For Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, affectionately known as May, the story of her betrothal took a rather complicated turn. In the late 19th century, Queen Victoria was thoroughly impressed by May's strong sense of duty and intellect, selecting her as the absolute perfect bride for her grandson, Prince Albert Victor, who was second in line to the throne. In December 1891, the court joyfully announced their engagement. When you look at the official portraits taken right after the proposal, you can clearly see a delicate ring on her left hand. Historical accounts and photographic evidence strongly suggest that Prince Albert Victor gave her a half-hoop ring set with alternating diamonds and rubies. It was a classic, beautiful choice for the era. But this engagement would last barely 6 weeks. In January 1892, a devastating influenza pandemic swept through the country. The young prince contracted the illness, which quickly developed into pneumonia, and he passed away at the age of just 28. The shock was absolute. May was completely shattered, writing to Queen Victoria about the heart-rending despair she witnessed in her fiancé's family. But this tragedy also created an unprecedented royal dilemma. What exactly does a monarchy do when the ideal, hand-picked future queen is suddenly left without a groom, and the line of succession shifts directly to the younger brother? The answer, as it turned out, lay in shared grief. Prince George, the new heir to the throne, mourned his older brother deeply alongside May. Over the following year, sharing that grief actually brought them much closer, and a genuine affection grew between them. In May 1893, while walking in the secluded gardens of Richmond Park, George asked May to marry him, and she joyfully accepted. But this is where we run into a fascinating jewelry mystery. When you examine the photographs of Princess May taken during her second engagement, there's a rather striking detail on her left hand. She is still prominently wearing the ruby and diamond half-hoop ring given to her by her late fiancé. To our modern sensibilities, wearing a deceased fiancé's ring while newly engaged to his brother might seem entirely unimaginable. But in the highly sentimental Victorian culture, keeping a piece of jewelry to honor a departed loved one was considered deeply respectful and completely appropriate. But you have to admit, it must have been a rather delicate situation for Prince George. How exactly do you present an engagement ring to a woman who is still wearing the one given to her by your late brother? For years, many have wondered what kind of engagement ring he gave her, or whether he gave her one at all. But a fascinating recent archival study by art historian Leah Felicitas Doding sheds completely new light on this story. It turns out that to find George's betrothal gift, we shouldn't be looking at her fingers, but at her wrists. George did not give May an engagement ring. Instead, he presented her with an engagement bracelet. This was actually a novel American fashion trend that was just beginning to make its way across the Atlantic to Europe. In formal portraits taken by the photographer Lafayette in the summer of 1893, you can clearly see May wearing a distinctive chain-link bracelet featuring a large cabochon stone on her left wrist. What makes this gesture so incredibly touching is the specific stone George chose. According to contemporary press reports, the bracelet was set with chrysoprase. Why a cloudy green chrysoprase? At the time, newspapers noted that the princess had a superstitious dread of repeating the tragic fate of her first engagement. Chrysoprase was widely celebrated as a talisman that brought good luck, acting as the complete antithesis to the supposedly unlucky opal. By choosing a lucky bracelet instead of a traditional ring, George found the most elegant, tactful solution possible. He did not force her to remove his brother's memory from her finger, and he avoided any awkward visual competition between two engagement rings. And perhaps that lucky green stone really did work its magic. Their marriage, which was initially born out of royal duty and shared mourning, evolved into an incredibly strong, devoted partnership that guided the British Empire through some of its most turbulent decades. Let's look at what happens when a royal suitor faces a completely different challenge. A woman who was actually quite reluctant to take on a royal role. This brings us to the extraordinary courtship of Prince Albert, known to his family as Bertie, and the charming Scottish aristocrat, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Bertie, the second son of King George V, was famously reserved and struggled with a difficult stammer. But from the moment he set his sights on Elizabeth, he was completely, hopelessly in love. Elizabeth, however, felt very differently. It wasn't that she didn't care for him. She felt a great deal of tenderness and trust toward Bertie. What truly terrified her was the royal institution itself. She was deeply attached to her quiet, private life, and she knew that marrying the king's son meant giving up her quiet, private life for the strict schedules and public duties of the British court. Even Bertie's mother, Queen Mary, recognized what a perfect match they could be. After visiting Elizabeth's family, the Queen declared she was the one girl who could make Bertie happy. Despite having his family's blessing, Bertie faced an agonizing uphill battle. When he proposed for the first time in February 1921, Elizabeth gently turned him down, confessing that the very thought of the marriage made her miserable. She refused him yet again in 1922. At the time, she even had other admirers, including Bertie's own charming equerry, James Stewart. But I think we really have to admire Bertie's quiet courage here. It takes a remarkable amount of emotional strength not to fall apart after the woman you love rejects you twice. Instead of walking away, his resolve only deepened. In January 1923, during a walk at her family's country estate, he tried for a third and final time. By then, James Stewart had moved to America, quietly leaving the picture. But more importantly, Elizabeth and Bertie had continued to spend a great deal of time together. In fact, after rejecting him the second time, she wrote to him calling him one of her best and most faithful friends. Perhaps it was this steady, unwavering loyalty that finally won her over. She said yes. Still, her fears lingered. She admitted in a private letter to a friend that no one was more surprised by her decision than herself, and she wrote to her brother that accepting the proposal felt like hearing a door clanging shut behind her, never to open again. I sometimes wonder, if she had known that an abdication crisis was looming and that she would actually become queen, would she ever have agreed? The selection of the engagement ring was a shared, intimate moment. A London jeweler, Burt & Co., brought a selection of rings directly to Buckingham Palace. Together, they chose a classic design featuring a large central sapphire flanked by diamonds. However, there was a slight complication. The ring was simply too large for Elizabeth's finger, and the craftsman realized that a basic resizing would completely ruin the delicate balance of the setting. So, the jeweler hurried back to his Mayfair workshop to remake the entire piece from scratch. He managed to finish it by noon on a Friday, handing it directly to the Duke, just in time for Elizabeth to proudly wear it on her very first formal visit to the extended royal family at Sandringham the next morning. We often look for instant fairy tale romance in royal stories, but I think the reality of Bertie and Elizabeth's marriage is far more beautiful. Their love wasn't a sudden, blinding flash. It was a profoundly deep bond that grew slowly, solidifying entirely when they were unexpectedly thrust onto the throne in 1936. Through the immense stress of the abdication and the terrifying years of the Second World War, they became completely emotionally dependent on one another. They truly remained happy with one another until the very end, forming a crucial partnership that ultimately saved the monarchy. While she faithfully wore her original sapphire engagement ring throughout those early years, she eventually began to swap it out for her daytime engagements. By the mid-1940s, she was frequently seen wearing a highly unusual and striking alternative just above her wedding band, a large Baroque pearl and diamond ring shaped almost like a luminous sugarloaf cabochon. The exact origin of this pearl ring remains a historical mystery. Was it an older piece pulled from the royal vaults? Or perhaps it was part of the magnificent jewelry inheritance she received from the wealthy socialite Margaret Greville. Nobody knows for certain. Personally, I can't help but wonder if her original sapphire ring simply proved too impractical for daily wear, or perhaps even suffered some damage over the years. Considering how frequently she wore this pearl ring, almost as if it were a second engagement ring, I like to think it might have been a later, deeply personal gift from her devoted Bertie to replace the original. Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip's story is quite different. It wasn't a carefully orchestrated political match, but a genuine connection that simply grew over the years, even while they were separated during the war. Elizabeth and Philip first crossed paths at a family wedding, but it was their meeting at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth in 1939 that truly sparked the relationship. Elizabeth was just 13 years old, naturally reserved and rather shy, while the 18-year-old Philip was a dashing naval cadet with a real zest for adventure. She was instantly smitten. Throughout the terrifying years of the Second World War, while Philip served as an officer in the Royal Navy, the two exchanged countless letters, and she kept a framed photograph of him right by her bed. By the summer of 1946, Philip had quietly proposed at Balmoral. But marrying the future queen meant stepping into a completely new life. Before the engagement could be officially announced to the public, Philip underwent a major transition. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, became a British subject, and adopted his mother's family surname, Mountbatten. When it came to the engagement ring, his family had endured years of exile and political turmoil, meaning he didn't have a vast fortune to spend. However, his mother, Princess Alice, had managed to hold on to a truly magnificent family heirloom, an aquamarine and diamond tiara gifted to her in 1903 by her aunt and uncle, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia. Alice traveled to a bank in Paris specifically to retrieve the tiara so her son could use its diamonds. There is actually a rather amusing detail about the creation of this piece. According to Princess Alice, Philip was so terrified of being recognized by the public and spoiling the royal secret that he didn't even dare to show his face at the jeweler. Instead, his mother took on the task, going to Philip Antrobus in London to help oversee the design. They repurposed the diamonds to create a classic, elegant ring featuring a brilliant 3-carat solitaire, flanked by smaller diamonds on each side, all set in platinum. When he finally presented it to Elizabeth, it was a bit too large, but it was quickly resized just in time for their official engagement announcement in the summer of 1947. Elizabeth obviously owned a vast collection of historical jewels, but this engagement ring meant the world to her. She wore it regularly for the next 7 decades. To me, it serves as a quiet, constant reminder of an absolutely incredible love story, a marriage that lasted 73 years. She once beautifully noted that Philip was simply her strength and stay all those years, and this ring was the very first symbol of that unbreakable bond. But beyond its romantic history, this ring also held a rather brilliant hidden function. It actually became a secret code for her royal staff. Whenever the Queen was at a public engagement and started subtly twisting the engagement ring around her finger, her aides knew exactly what it meant. Her Majesty had quite enough, and it was time to swiftly and politely bring the conversation to an end. I always smile at that detail. Sometimes, an engagement ring doesn't signal the start of a straightforward, lifelong romance. Instead, it becomes the symbol of a fairy tale that the whole world desperately wanted to believe in, but which simply didn't exist behind closed doors. This brings us to a story we all know, but perhaps haven't looked at through the deeply personal lens of expectations versus reality. The marriage of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer. When Charles proposed to the 19-year-old Diana at Windsor Castle in February 1981, he actually did so without a ring. It wasn't until later that a special selection of rings was brought down from London by the jewelers, Gerard. Now, as we saw with the Queen Mother, choosing from a jeweler's selection wasn't entirely unprecedented. But what made Diana's choice so unusual was that the spectacular 12-carat oval Ceylon sapphire she picked was actually a stock item in the Gerard catalog. This meant that anyone, provided they had a remarkably large bank account, could technically purchase the exact same ring. Almost overnight, it became the most famous and replicated piece of jewelry in the world, representing the ultimate princess dream to millions. But the reality was starkly different. Diana was incredibly young, stepping into a vastly isolating and overwhelming role, and Charles was entering the marriage burdened by duty rather than absolute devotion. You might remember their famously awkward engagement interview where, when the reporter asked if they were in love, Diana quickly said, "Of course," while Charles famously replied, "Whatever love means." While the engagement photos looked picture-perfect, the couple was simply on very shaky ground from the very beginning. Interestingly, even after their official separation, Diana continued to wear the sapphire for quite some time, treating it less as a symbol of her marriage and more as a familiar, beautiful accessory on her own terms. We see a completely different path to a royal engagement when we look at the next chapter of Charles's life. His relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles is one of the most heavily scrutinized stories of the modern era. They first met back in 1970 at a polo match, discovering a shared sense of humor and a mutual love for the outdoors. But royal expectations and the rigid conventions surrounding the heir to the throne ultimately pulled them apart, leading them both into different marriages. But despite their separate marriages, their connection endured. It was anything but easy. Their relationship weathered intense public condemnation, the highly damaging scandal of leaked private phone calls in 1993, and years of relentless media scrutiny. For many years, the idea of their marriage remained deeply uncomfortable for the royal household, including Queen Elizabeth II herself. But as the years went by, the Queen's stance steadily softened, and she ultimately granted her formal consent for them to marry. Finally, in February 2005, an incredible 35 years after they first met, Charles and Camilla announced their engagement. For the proposal, Charles chose a classic, elegant platinum ring featuring a square-cut central diamond, perfectly balanced by 3 diamond baguettes on either side. This stunning heirloom originally belonged to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The piece was originally given to her by King George VI as a love token, and she frequently favored it for elegant evening outings, like trips to the theater. Camilla officially debuted the ring at a gala dinner at Windsor Castle the very night their engagement was announced, happily telling guests she was just coming down to earth. This engagement marked a major turning point for the couple. After decades of controversy, they quietly settled into their royal duties together. Public opinion did not transform overnight, but over the years, the intensity of hostility toward Camilla noticeably softened. And as we know, the ultimate validation of their long journey came years later, when Queen Elizabeth publicly expressed her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort. Whatever public opinion may once have been, their partnership ultimately endured far longer than many expected. There is a very different, much quieter kind of romance when we look at Prince William and Catherine. Their story didn't begin with a sudden palace announcement or overwhelming royal pressure. It actually started at St. Andrews University, where they were friends for over a year before anything romantic happened. They even shared a student flat with other friends. During their engagement interview, William shared a rather charming detail about those early days. He admitted to trying to cook fancy dinners to impress her, but something would inevitably catch on fire or boil over, leaving Catherine to step in and save the meal. William was very mindful of the past. He had seen the toll that a rushed royal marriage took on his parents, and he was determined to do things differently. He didn't want to pressure Catherine. He wanted to give her time to understand the reality of royal life, even if that meant stepping back for a while. They actually went through a highly publicized breakup in the spring of 2007. Catherine later admitted she wasn't happy about the split at the time, but it ultimately gave them both the space to realize just how much they meant to each other. When William finally decided the time was right in October 2010, during a trip to Kenya, he did something quite sweet. For 3 whole weeks, he carried his mother's spectacular 12-carat sapphire ring tucked right inside his casual travel rucksack, terrified he was going to lose it somewhere in Africa. Receiving the most famous engagement ring in the world is, without a doubt, a deeply romantic, touching gesture, but it is also a serious challenge. Stepping into the royal family with Diana's sapphire on your hand instantly invites endless public comparisons. Yet, Catherine managed to do something remarkable. She didn't let the ring's heavy legacy turn her into the shadow of her mother-in-law. Over the years, she has truly made the sapphire her own, wearing it with a quiet, steady dignity that perfectly suits her. What is truly beautiful about their story is that their bond genuinely seems to grow stronger with every passing year. They have been through quite a lot recently, and their mutual support is so visible. Just recently, during a live radio interview from the Isles of Scilly, William became quite emotional speaking about Catherine and her recent health recovery. He warmly called her an amazing mom, an amazing wife, adding that she has been absolutely stunning, brilliant. And looking at them today, it is clear that a royal marriage built on genuine friendship, patience, and mutual respect can truly weather almost anything. Every ring we looked at today began its life as just a simple combination of metal and gemstones. But the moment it was placed on a royal finger, it became something much more, a symbol of a unique union and a quiet witness to a real love story. I am so curious to hear your thoughts. Which of these stories, or which specific ring, touched you the most today? Please let me know in the comments below. I always look forward to reading your impressions. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it with a friend who loves history, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story. Thank you so much for your time and for spending part of your day with me. I will see you next time!